It's the end of the 11th century, and Europe is, frankly, a mess. It's a patchwork of squabbling lords, land is tight, there are far too many armed young men with too much free time and not enough inheritance, and the general mood is that of a room full of people holding weapons and looking for a reason. Meanwhile, over in the east, the Byzantine Empire, the surviving Roman half, still going, still convinced it's the classy one, is under pressure and sends a polite request west for a bit of military help. Some mercenaries maybe, a modest favor. What they got in response was not modest. What they got was the medieval equivalent of asking a neighbor to help you move a couch and having 400 strangers show up at your door, armed, hungry, and under the impression they now live there. Because in 1095, Pope Urban II gave a speech. And it was a very good speech, in the sense that a very good speech is one that gets an enormous number of people killed. He called for a holy war to retake Jerusalem, and he sweetened the offer considerably. Anyone who went would have their sins forgiven. Now, this was an era where people were extremely worried about their sins, and here was an all-inclusive package deal, travel, adventure, plunder, and eternal salvation, all for the low, low price of possibly dying horribly 1,000 miles from home. The response was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of people took the offer, which brings us to the first small problem. Not all of them waited for the actual army. Before the organized knights were ready, a preacher whipped up a massive crowd of ordinary people, peasants, the poor, the enthusiastic and underqualified, and they simply left. Early. Without supplies, without training, without much of a plan beyond walk east until Jerusalem. This is generally called the People's Crusade, and it went about as well as a group project where everyone shows up but nobody read the assignment. They caused chaos along the way, ran out of food, and when they finally reached hostile territory, they were almost immediately and comprehensively destroyed. Their great contribution to the liberation of the Holy Land was demonstrating very thoroughly how not to do it. Then the professionals arrived. The actual knights, organized, armored, and genuinely dangerous, set off on what we now call the First Crusade, and against essentially everyone's expectations, including probably their own, they succeeded. They marched across an entire continent and beyond, endured sieges, starvation, disease, and the general experience of being European men in armor in a Middle Eastern summer, and in 1099 they took Jerusalem. I'll be measured about what happened next, because I have to be. The capture of the city was accompanied by a massacre of its inhabitants that even by the standards of the time was remembered as extreme. The men who had marched 1,000 miles in the name of a religion of mercy arrived, achieved their holy goal, and celebrated in a manner that was neither merciful nor, one suspects, particularly holy. It's one of those moments that historians describe carefully, and everyone else describes with a long, uncomfortable silence. And here's the thing people forget. That was the First Crusade. There were going to be a lot more, because the Crusaders had a recurring problem, which is that taking a place and keeping a place are two completely different skills. They established their little Christian states in the east, narrow strips of territory surrounded on all sides by people who understandably wanted them gone, and then spent the next 2 centuries desperately trying to hold on while sending home increasingly urgent messages that essentially read, "Everything is fine, please send more everything," So they kept launching new crusades to reinforce the old ones. And this is where the whole enterprise starts to resemble a man who keeps doubling down at a table where he has already lost badly and is now emotionally committed to the losing. The Second Crusade was a disaster. Enormous armies set out, achieved remarkably little, and mostly succeeded in proving that being extremely motivated is not the same as being extremely competent. The Third Crusade is the famous one, the celebrity season featuring big names on both sides, most notably Saladin, who retook Jerusalem, and Richard the Lionheart, who came to take it back. And it produced a lot of legendary maneuvering, dramatic standoffs, and mutual respect between rivals. And at the end of all that, all the marching, all the fighting, all the legend, Jerusalem remained in Saladin's hands. So, cinematically thrilling, strategically, they were roughly back where they started, just with more graves. And then we arrive at the Fourth Crusade, which I want to spend a moment on, because it is genuinely one of the great achievements in the history of missing the point. The Fourth Crusade was launched to, once again, retake Jerusalem. It did not retake Jerusalem. It did not go anywhere near Jerusalem. Through a spiraling chain of debt, bad decisions, and worse decisions made to fix the previous bad decisions, this crusade, organized by Christians to fight for Christianity, ended up attacking and brutally sacking Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the very Christian empire that had asked for help in the first place, all those years ago. Let me make sure that lands. The entire crusading movement began because Constantinople asked the West for a little military assistance, and roughly a century later, the West's response finally arrived in the form of a crusader army that sacked, looted, and gutted Constantinople itself. It's as if you called a locksmith, and a century later he showed up, ignored the lock, set fire to your house, and left with your furniture. The Byzantines never fully recovered. It was a wound they were still bleeding from centuries later. After that, the momentum was gone, even if the Crusades weren't. There were more of them, each a bit more desperate, a bit more delusional. There was one that was supposed to strike at Egypt, and mostly struck at the Crusaders' own supply of dignity. There were expeditions that dissolved into nothing. There is a persistent, probably exaggerated but deeply telling tradition about a children's crusade. The very fact that people believe such a thing could happen tells you the mood had shifted from holy war to something closer to mass delusion. Slowly, one lost stronghold at a time, the Crusader states were squeezed out of existence until the last of them fell and the whole 200-year project quietly ended, not with triumph, but with the historical equivalent of everyone gradually agreeing not to talk about it. So, 2 centuries. Wave after wave of the most motivated people in Europe hurling themselves eastward again and again, absolutely certain that this time it would work. Which brings us to the number. How many people died in all of this? And here, once again, is the revelation. Because the honest answer is the same uncomfortable answer we keep arriving at. We don't know. And this time it's not only because the record keepers died, it's because there was no single war to count. The Crusades weren't one event. They were 200 years of wars, massacres, sieges, and slaughter, spread across multiple continents, fought by people who had no interest in and no ability to keep a tally. In an era where counting the dead meant, at best, a chronicler writing down an impressively large number that felt appropriately biblical. The figures you'll see cited climb into the millions, often placed somewhere in the range of 1 to 3 million, sometimes higher, across the entire span of the campaigns. Once you add in the battles, the massacres of civilians, the starvation, the disease that always travels with armies, and the countless deaths that no one thought to record because the dead were peasants or foreigners, or simply too numerous to matter to the people holding the pen. And that's the part I keep circling back to. The number is enormous, and it is also a guess, because the vast majority of the people who died in the Crusades died as a footnote to somebody else's holy cause. They weren't counted because to the people running the show, they didn't count. Millions of human beings reduced to a rounding error in a war fought over a city in the name of mercy by people who kept insisting, right up to the end, that God was clearly on their side. All of them. On every side. Simultaneously. For 200 years. Anyway, that was the Crusades. I'll be here, regrettably,